In this video, we'll be taking a look at 5 college basketball games happening on March 6th, 2026, and providing you with free team picks and total picks for each one of those games, so 10 picks in total. Welcome back to Cash Out Sports. Let's dive right into it. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and to click the bell icon to get notified as soon as these videos get released, so that you have more time to plan out your bets as we provide these videos on a daily basis. I can guarantee that you'll have all the important information that you'll need on these 5 college basketball games after fully watching this video. One more thing before we start. If you would like to gain access to our best exclusive sports picks to take your journey to the next level, then check out our Patreon in the link down below, where we offer our best single picks, parlay picks, and much more. Now let's get started. VCU versus Dayton. This matchup in early March has that classic feel where one team gets a little extra market respect simply because of the arena and the crowd, not because of which group has actually been sharper from wire to wire this season. VCU heads into Dayton carrying a record of 23-7, while Dayton sits at 21-9, and that gap is not massive, but it is enough to say one side has been just a bit more consistent from those early non-conference nights through the grind of league play. The interesting part is that the pricing still tilts toward Dayton as the slight home favorite, even though VCU brings the more aggressive personality on offense, the more dynamic scoring profile, and a style that tends to yank opponents out of their comfort zone rather than politely trade half-court sets. The first meeting in Richmond told that story in big bold letters, with VCU erupting for 99 points and turning Dayton's 73 into background noise, and it was less about some miracle shooting binge and more about the simple fact that one team was dictating tempo while the other kept trying to patch leaks. Here is the thing, that kind of result matters because it shows how these particular jerseys match up, not just how they look in a box score against the rest of the conference. Dayton prefers structure, longer possessions, and a calmer rhythm where the ball finds the right shooter after a few passes, while VCU is far more comfortable living in that slightly chaotic space where pressure, pace, and constant attacking create cracks that do not always show up in traditional stats but definitely show up on the scoreboard. When the spread is small and the game feels like a coin toss in terms of who might sneak out the win, that style advantage often tilts things toward the team that can generate runs, that can come back from a slow start, and that can turn one loose 5-minute stretch into the defining stretch of the night. Honestly, that is exactly the sort of environment where you would rather be catching a few points with the live wire offense than laying them with the steadier, slightly slower group that already proved vulnerable when these two shared the floor. Layer on top that Dayton is dealing with a freshman guard lost for the season after shoulder surgery and another reserve guard listed as questionable, while VCU's concerns sit more with front court depth pieces who do not really alter the core rotation, and the edge in overall stability quietly leans toward the visitor rather than the host. In a tight late-season conference game where nerves, whistles, and free throws can swing the entire margin in the final minute, the side that has already shown it can blow this matchup open and now gets the luxury of that underdog cushion feels like the more comfortable ticket to hold when the final horn sounds. As our first pick for this matchup, the VCU Rams to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. The first time these teams met, the scoreboard turned into a track meet, a 172-point explosion with that 99-73 finish. And a number like that tends to stick in your mind the way a catchy chorus from a pop song refuses to leave your head. It is tempting to assume that when the same two teams meet again, you are automatically in for another fireworks show, but the longer season sample tells a different, quieter story about how their games usually feel. Both groups typically live in a world where total points land closer to the mid-140s than the 170s, with Dayton especially leaning toward controlled, lower-scoring outcomes that come from patient offense and a defense that does not give up easy, early clock looks. VCU's scoring average runs higher, sitting in that low 80s range in part because of some non-conference blowouts, but their tempo still sits only a bit above average rather than in full-on track meet territory, and when that style collides with Dayton's preference for half-court basketball, possessions tend to feel heavier and more deliberate. Here is the thing, when you look past the one wild box score and focus on the way these teams actually approach possessions, you see two defenses that are good enough to force late clock decisions and two coaching staffs that are not exactly eager to trade quick threes for 40 minutes in March. This stage of the season usually nudges totals downward all by itself because every trip matters more, rotations get slightly tighter, and coaches lean on their main guys a little longer, which naturally slows things down as players manage fatigue and avoid silly fouls. On top of that, Dayton's rotation on the perimeter is a bit thinner with that freshman guard already ruled out for the year, and another reserve guard labeled as questionable, which subtly pushes them toward trusting their primary creators, using longer possessions, and avoiding the kind of up-and-down pace that can expose a short bench. The number sitting on this game asks both teams to keep scoring at a brisk clip for the full 40 minutes, closer to that first meeting than to their usual rhythm, and that feels like a stretch in a revenge spot where both sides have film, both staffs are emphasizing defensive pride, and the natural tendency is to value each trip instead of trading haymakers. So while the memory of that earlier shootout is loud, the more likely script here looks like a tense, possession-by-possession contest that lands in a more modest scoring band rather than a repeat of that outlier scoreboard. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. Central Florida versus West Virginia. The scene shifts to Morgantown for a Big 12 clash that feels every bit like early March basketball, edgy and noisy and just a little unpredictable. The crowd will lean into West Virginia, the building will buzz, and the odds makers still hand the home side a small cushion as if the script already expects the visitors to play the role of supporting cast. That story sounds tidy, but honestly it ignores how shaky that comfort has been whenever this Central Florida group shows up and refuses to go away. Central Florida walks in at 20-9 overall and 9-8 in the Big 12, while West Virginia sits at 17-13 with an 8-9 mark in league play. Those records are close enough that if you covered the names and only looked at the resumes, you would probably shrug and say these teams live in the same neighborhood competitively. Yet one of them is treated as the clearly safer pick simply because it gets its own locker room and its own student section behind it. Recent form does not exactly scream stability for the hosts either. West Virginia has dropped 4 of its last 5, and in that same stretch it has cashed the ticket against the number only once, stumbling at home to Utah and Baylor and slipping again on the road at Kansas State. Central Florida, on the other hand, has gone 3-2 across its last 5, and the 2 setbacks were the kind that stick in a locker room, an overtime thriller against Oklahoma State and a 1-point loss to Baylor, decided by a combined 8 points that could have flipped with a single bounce here or there. That is the pattern of a team that keeps punching in the final minute instead of quietly accepting its fate on the road. Over the full season, Central Florida sits at 20-9 with a 5-4 record in true road games, which is quietly solid for a program asked to fly around a new league and adjust on the fly. West Virginia has been strong in Morgantown, sure, but it has not exactly turned the place into a fortress where games are over by the first media timeout. If anything, the home side has lived inside narrow margins so often that a close spread feels more like a coin toss than a safety net. The betting market history only leans harder toward the visitors when you pull it apart a bit. Central Florida has been around the middle overall against the spread, but when you look specifically at games where it gets points, it has turned into a profitable underdog, covering far more than it fails and often hanging around deep into the second half. West Virginia, by contrast, sits slightly underwater against the number and has struggled when asked to carry the favorite tag, a sign that the market has been just a little too generous toward the Mountaineers whenever they are supposed to control the game. That kind of pattern wears on a fan base, but it is even more interesting for anyone looking at numbers on a screen and wondering who is really mispriced. There is also the memory of the first meeting, which might be the most telling piece in this whole thing. Central Florida built a double-digit second half lead in Orlando, roughly a 14-point cushion, before West Virginia scraped its way back and stole the game late. On the surface, that comeback looks like proof that the Mountaineers know how to beat this team, but if you zoom out, it also shows that Central Florida has already proved it can outplay this roster and this staff for long stretches, even on a night when the final score went the other way. Here is the thing, that sort of experience on the road, knowing you already had the other team wobbling once this season, feeds real confidence when the rematch hits winning time. Style only adds more weight to that feeling. Central Florida brings a fast-scoring, never quite comfortable pace that tends to keep games in that 1 or 2 possession window instead of letting the favorite drift away. West Virginia is more methodical, but when you play slower and lean on defense, you also leave yourself open to late swings, a quick burst from a confident guard, or one random 4-possession stretch where the underdog suddenly looks like the better team. In a spot like that, getting points stops feeling like a luxury and starts feeling like the main reason to get involved at all. As our first pick for this matchup, the UCF Knights to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. Central Florida lives in a rhythm that looks like something out of an arcade game, piling up points in the low 80s per night while giving almost as many back in the high 70s. Their average game total lands in the low 160s, which is wild considering how many Big 12 games turn into wrestling matches rather than track meets. That profile screams pace, quick decisions, and the kind of shot selection that would make an efficiency chart twitch, but it is also a big part of their identity and it does not usually vanish, even in tough gyms. West Virginia sits on the other end of the spectrum, and that contrast is where things really get fun for people who love tempo charts. The Mountaineers score in the high 60s on average and give up only the mid-60s, which pulls their typical game down into the mid-130s in total points. That is more old-school Big 12, a grind, plenty of half-court possessions, bodies on the floor, and defensive possessions that feel like they last forever. So you have one team that wants to get out and go and another that is more than happy to slow it down, which sets up a real tug of war over how the scoreboard moves. The first meeting between these two was a pretty neat case study in that battle. The final score landed in the low 70s for West Virginia and the high 60s for Central Florida, right around the middle ground between Central Florida's usual fireworks and West Virginia's quieter nights. What is interesting is that this played out in Orlando, where Central Florida is usually most comfortable pushing tempo. The fact that the total still settled in that middle band suggests that West Virginia's defensive gravity and pace control have real weight in this matchup, even when the Knights are at home. Season-long betting results lean heavily toward a lower scoring script, especially when West Virginia is involved. The Mountaineers have seen more unders than overs in their line games, and the ratio gets even more tilted when you filter for games in Morgantown or games where they are expected to handle business. It is as if the market keeps expecting their offensive output to pop a little more than it actually does, while their defense keeps dragging totals back down toward the 60s. Central Florida, despite the wild scoring profile and a few recent shootouts, has not been an over machine either, especially when it comes in as an underdog and the total is shaded higher to account for that up-tempo style. Once the number climbs, their games have a habit of snagging under instead of exploding past expectations. There is also the human side of this, which matters more than most models like to admit. If Central Florida is even a touch thinner because of question marks around pieces like Jeremy Fumina and Tanner Jones, that can tighten the rotation and subtly encourage longer possessions, more patience, and a little extra attention to managing energy across 40 minutes, especially in a loud building. In a physical Big 12 game, whistles stack up, players get bumped, and coaches lean harder on half-court sets as the second half wears on. A fast start can suddenly slow into a more deliberate finish, and what looked like a free-flowing night early can become more about getting one good shot and then getting your tail back in transition. Put all of that together, the contrasting tempos, the past meeting landing in that middle band, the strong lean toward lower scoring results in this building, and the possibility of a slightly shortened Central Florida rotation, and the picture shifts from track meet to something a bit more controlled. The scoreboard can still move. There is too much talent on the floor for it not to, but the likelihood of it soaring far past expectations starts to feel smaller once you really connect all these threads. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. Miami, Ohio versus Ohio. Picture this matchup in your head for a second. You have an unbeaten Miami, Ohio group walking into Athens, carrying a perfect record like a fragile piece of glass that everyone wants to crack. 30-0 overall, 17-0 in league play, and they stroll into the building of a very human Ohio squad sitting at 15-15 and 9-8 in conference games. That record line alone creates a weird mix of pressure and swagger because one side is playing for history and the other is playing with nothing to lose. The funny part is that this gym has not exactly rolled out the red carpet for Miami, Ohio over the years. They have stacked plenty of losses here, and fans in that building remember those games like they happened last week. You can already imagine the student section seeing an undefeated team come through the tunnel and thinking, this is our shot to be on SportsCenter for ruining their night. Home energy is real in college hoops, especially in a mid-major spot where everyone on campus knows when the unbeaten team is coming to town. On paper, though, this Miami, Ohio team does not really resemble the versions that kept walking out of Athens frustrated. They move the ball, stretch the floor, and play that modern, space-filled style that lets them attack in waves rather than through just one star. They are comfortable on the road, they have been winning when favored, and they have handled the mental side of being the hunted instead of the hunter all season. Even when they lost a key guard earlier in the year with that season-ending knee injury, they did not wobble for long. Someone slid into the role, the ball kept humming around the arc, and the results kept coming. That is the kind of resilience that shows up late in the season when legs are tired and scouting reports are long. We already saw a preview of how these teams match up when Miami, Ohio handled business at home, putting up 90 and creating real separation on the scoreboard. That result matters not just because of the margin, but because of the way it happened. They got what they wanted offensively for long stretches, and Ohio had to work pretty hard just to keep contact. Now, shift that same matchup into a tougher building, sprinkle in the revenge angle for Ohio, and the script gets more emotional, but the core basketball logic does not flip. Miami, Ohio still brings the cleaner execution, the deeper trust in their system, and the kind of late-game poise that comes from winning close and not so close all season. Honestly, this spot almost invites you to overthink the history and talk yourself into the chaos. The banners, the noise, the past losing streak in that arena, all of that makes for a great storyline, but players live in the present far more than fans do. For the guys in those jerseys, this is another hurdle on a path they already committed to months ago. They know eyes are on them, which strangely can tighten a team, but with this group it has mostly sharpened the focus. When you strip away the nostalgia around the building and just look at how these two teams are currently playing, one side simply brings a stronger, more reliable profile to cover a favorite number on the road. As our first pick for this matchup, the Miami, Ohio Redhawks to cover the spread as favorites is our full game side pick. The number is set high, partly because Miami, Ohio carries a reputation for fireworks, and Ohio can get hot enough to make a box score look like a pickup run at the rec. It sounds simple to expect a shootout. High-flying offense, loose college whistle, rowdy crowd, and a star chasing an upset. That kind of picture sells an over in seconds. Here is the thing though, recent games for both of these teams have not really behaved like that story. Miami, Ohio has been landing in spots where the totals were lofty and the actual scores slid underneath more often than not. The same pattern has been showing up with Ohio, where final numbers have leaned surprisingly modest compared with the expectations. Even when these two met earlier and Miami, Ohio put up 90, the combined score still stayed shy of an even bigger target. That is a pretty strong hint that the market view of this matchup can float a bit higher than the on-court reality. March adds another twist. Coaches shorten rotations, trust their top guys, and squeeze more control out of each possession. They have fresh film of the earlier meeting, which means both staffs know exactly which actions hurt them and which mismatches they are willing to live with. That kind of familiarity often slows things down just a touch. Instead of trading wild early clock threes all night, you get more half-court sets, more deliberate reads, and more trips where both sides are trying to force the other into Plan B. Ohio, if it really wants to make this interesting, probably does not want a track meet. The more this turns into a race to a giant number, the more it tilts toward the team that has been comfortable playing clean, efficient offense all year. So a smarter path for the home side is to make every Miami, Ohio possession feel like a chore, walk the ball up when they can, and lean on the crowd to help them get one stop at a time. On the flip side, if Miami, Ohio gets out ahead, they have shown they can lean into control, run clock, and trust their set offense rather than just gunning for a style points explosion. There is always the chaos factor in college hoops, no question. A whistle-heavy crew, early foul trouble, or an overtime could throw gasoline on the scoring. But if you take a step back and marry the recent trends with how both coaches are likely to script this thing, the more reasonable expectation is a game where the scoring feels lively without actually climbing all the way to where that big number suggests. The energy in the building might feel like a shootout, yet the math on the scoreboard can still land short. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. St. John's versus Seton Hall. St. John's walks into Newark with a chance to grab at least a share of the Big East regular season crown, carrying a record of 24-6 overall and 17-2 in league play, while Seton Hall has pulled off a major year-to-year glow-up from a brutal 2-18 conference run last season to a far sturdier 20-10 overall and 10-9 in league play. St. John's has spent the winter lighting up scoreboards, sitting in that upper tier nationally on offense at roughly 82 to 83 points per night with about an 11-point average scoring margin, and holding opponents in the low 70s, so most of their games feel like they are played with the accelerator already halfway down. Seton Hall lives in a different neighborhood entirely, averaging around 70 points per game, ranking much lower in pure scoring, but shaping up as one of the country's toughest scoring defenses by giving up roughly 65 points a night, so you get that clear contrast between a team that wants rhythm and flow and a team that is perfectly happy if the game feels like a shoving match in the mud. Stylistically, it is almost cartoon simple. One team wants a track meet, the other would prefer a tug of war where nobody lets go. St. John's has already shown that it can handle Seton Hall's grind. They erased a 15-point second half hole in the first meeting and flipped it into a 65-60 win, which is the sort of comeback that sticks in a locker room and reminds a group that they always have a run in them. They rolled through a 13-game win streak, their longest in 41 years, and even after getting hammered by UConn, they bounced back with a blowout of Villanova and a great escape against Georgetown, the kind of stretch where you can almost feel the team learning how to live with pressure instead of shrinking from it. Inside, Zubi Ejiofor gives them that reliable anchor. He is on the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year watch list and leads St. John's in scoring, rebounding, and blocks, which basically means when possessions slow down they can throw him the ball and trust that something decent will happen more often than not. On the perimeter and on the wings, late-game sparks like Joson Seton have already tilted real outcomes. He dropped all 15 of his points in the final 14 minutes of that Georgetown comeback, and that kind of closing burst is exactly what you want in a tight spread situation where a couple of late possessions decide everything. There is a rhythm to teams like this. When they believe they can flip a run anytime, it changes how they handle those little 5-point swings that usually break less confident groups. Seton Hall, on the other hand, leans into a physical, defense-first personality with a rim protector like Najai Hines and a primary creator in Adam Clark, and that pairing shapes how they play both ends even when the offense goes through some dry spells. The tricky part for the Pirates right now is health, because Najai Hines, Adam Clark, Trey Parker, Godswiller Harrion, and Patrick Suzwimnik are all tagged as questionable, and Josim Felton is out for the season with a torn ACL. So Shaheen Holloway is trying to keep his identity while juggling who is actually available on a given night. St. John's has its own issues. Kelvin Odie is questionable with a leg problem, and depth pieces Kasper Poto with a hip issue and Imran Soljanovic with a knee injury are out for the season. But this entire surge has happened with that reality already baked into the cake, and the core rotation that carried them here is still intact. When you look at how this matchup is being priced, you are basically being asked a simple question. Does St. John's blend of high-end scoring, improved defense, and real title-level urgency travel well enough in this spot to stretch the result past a one-possession slugfest in the final minute? You also have that angle where the Red Storm have been very strong straight up when listed as favorites, while Seton Hall has been pesky against the number but far less reliable in actually flipping those underdog roles into outright wins, which matters when you need more than just a close game. Given their proven edge in the first matchup, their ability to win playing fast or grinding through a half-court game, and the fact that so many of Seton Hall's key pieces are sitting on the injury report instead of in a clean bill of health category, the side that projects to finish with a little more breathing room is the one that already showed it could claw back and still close the show. As our first pick for this matchup, the St. John's Red Storm to cover the spread as favorites is our full game side pick. On paper, St. John's games look like they lean toward higher scoring. They put up about 82.3 points per game and give up just over 71, which means an average Red Storm night tends to land somewhere in the mid-150s on the scoreboard. Seton Hall tilts the other way, scoring about 70.3 points, allowing only 64.7, and settling into a mid-130s profile, with an offense that sits outside the glamorous range in national rankings but a scoring defense that hangs in that national top 10 conversation. That mix of a slower, less explosive offense with suffocating defense is backed up by the underlying numbers. They show up as an elite defensive efficiency team, rack up blocks and steals, and lean hard on offensive rebounds just to squeeze enough points out of each trip to keep pace. When these two actually shared the floor, the result did not turn into some wild 80-78 fireworks show. It landed at 65-60, a total of 125, even though Seton Hall built a big lead before losing it, which tells you a lot about how sticky the style battle becomes once the nerves settle. It acts like a blueprint. Once both coaches grab the whiteboard, the game tends to sink into more half-court sets and fewer full-court sprints, and that usually drags the total downward even if there are a few spurts that feel frantic in the moment. If you have watched enough Big East basketball in March, you know the soundtrack: long possessions, bodies hitting the floor, and entire sections of the crowd groaning at yet another late shot clock jumper. The season-long totals history lines up with that picture too. Seton Hall sits at 11-19 to the over, St. John's sits at 12-18, so both teams have leaned to the side where the market slightly overshoots the actual scoring that shows up on the floor. Only 2 of Seton Hall's last 5 games and 5 of their last 16 at home have slipped past the number, which quietly tells you that their building tends to drag opponents into slower, more physical experiences where every bucket feels a little more expensive. You can think of it like playing a road game in a gym that naturally dampens tempo. Even fast teams sometimes leave feeling like they never quite got into 5th gear. Both benches are also thinner than they look on a printed roster sheet, with all those questionable tags for the Pirates and the season-ending injuries for St. John's depth pieces. And that matters because it often forces coaches to shorten rotations and live with lineups that prioritize defense and mistake free possessions over wild pace. There is also proof of just how low the Red Storm's offensive floor can sink in a slugfest. That 72-40 loss at UConn came with a brutal 19.6% shooting night, the worst field goal percentage by any power conference team this season. And while that is an outlier, it shows that long-scoring droughts are not just a theoretical risk. Put all of that together, Seton Hall's elite defense and limited offense, the first meeting landing well below a typical high-scoring expectation. And both teams' habit of seeing numbers come in a little under where they were projected, and the most reasonable script feels like a contest that plays closer to a race toward the mid-60s than a sprint into the mid-70s. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. UNLV versus San Diego State. UNLV and San Diego State meet with very different kinds of pressure sitting on their shoulders. San Diego State carries that heavy expectation vibe at home, with a crowd that usually treats this building like a fortress and a program that is used to winning here almost every single time. Recent form has not matched that reputation though, with several stumbles in a short span that have people asking what happened to that usual lockdown version of this team. The body language has looked tight at times, like a group that knows every possession is being judged with postseason talk swirling around them. UNLV walks in with a looser, more volatile energy, the kind of team that can frustrate you because its ceiling and floor are both loud and close together. Results lately have leaned toward that higher end, with clutch finishes, late shot making, and a willingness to keep throwing punches even when things get messy. They just handled 2 very different emotional tests, a rivalry game that turned into a marathon, followed by a statement blowout against one of the league's top dogs, and they did not blink in either spot. That kind of stretch tends to harden a locker room because players start to trust that even if there is a bad run or an ugly turnover, they can still claw their way back possession by possession. San Diego State still has the more stable home routine, the familiar rims, the crowd behind them, the usual pregame rhythm that coaches love. But that comfort can cut both ways when the expectation is not just to win, but to win comfortably, and every empty trip can feel like the scoreboard is judging you. UNLV, with nothing to lose and a recent track record of punching above its perceived weight, is built to be the annoying underdog that keeps playing through those swings instead of folding. They have shown a knack for absorbing early runs, answering with their own spurts, and stretching games into the kind of back and forth that keeps margins in a more compact range. The contrast becomes pretty clear. One team is trying to protect reputation in front of its home fans. The other is happy to be the disruptor that keeps hanging around and forcing a nervous glance at the scoreboard in the final minutes. In a matchup like that, where current form and mentality tilt toward a feisty road group that has already proved it can stand up to strong opponents, the underdog has a very real chance to stay inside a generous number and make things uncomfortable deep into the second half. As our first pick for this matchup, the UNLV Runnin' Rebels to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. UNLV games have turned into track meets more often than not, with their style encouraging pace, quick decisions, and possessions that do not waste much time. They give you the sense of a team that is comfortable trading buckets, where a made shot just means getting the ball back and trying something even bolder on the next trip. That kind of mindset usually shows up in their final scores, which have stacked up into a pattern of high totals rather than 1 or 2 random outliers. San Diego State, traditionally tagged as the slow and physical group, has been pulled into faster, more open contests recently, especially against opponents that push tempo and stretch the floor. When pressure is cranked up and defense is not firing on all cylinders, it is surprising how quickly a so-called grinded-out team starts relying on offense to keep them in games. The recent box scores reflect that shift, with opponents finding their way into the 70s and 80s, and the Aztecs often having to answer in kind just to keep contact. It creates a version of them that still plays hard on defense, but is living with more possessions and more scoring swings than in past years. When these two styles collide, the result usually is not quiet. UNLV's willingness to push pace, pull up early in the clock, and fire away from outside forces the other side to respond instead of sitting in a patient half-court script. San Diego State has enough offensive talent and pride, especially at home, to respond to that challenge rather than sitting back and letting the game crawl. Fouls and free throws tend to creep in when physicality and frustration mix, and those extra points with the clock stopped can quietly inflate a final number more than people expect. Recent meetings between these programs have already hinted at this, with several matchups landing in noticeably higher scoring territory than the reputation of the conference might suggest. The last time they met, the flow leaned toward scoring, with both sides finding solid stretches on offense and the combined total pushing into that upper range again. Nothing here suggests a sudden reversal into a slow, choppy, low-scoring grind, especially with one team riding a surge of offensive confidence and the other trying to prove it can answer the critics by putting together a strong performance on its home floor. Put together, the tempo, recent scoring trends, and the emotional stakes all point toward a game where points come in steady waves rather than sporadic bursts. As our second pick for this matchup, over the projected total is our full game total pick. That's all for now, so if you have any other games you would like reviewed, then leave a comment down below with the game you would like analyzed, subscribe to our channel, leave a like on this video, and we'll get to it as soon as we possibly can. We would also love to hear your opinion on the picks presented to you in this video, whether you agree or disagree with them, so leave a comment down below and do let us know.